Hello, welcome to another episode of the Short Story Workshop. My name is Matt Bowles. I am joined by Melody Bowles and Simone King. This week we will be reading And So They All Lived Happily Ever After by our very own Simone King, followed by a discussion. So, Simone, is there anything you would like to say to introduce us to this story?
No, I want you to make your own ideas about it and then I'll talk about it after.
So, here is And So They All Lived Happily Ever After by Simone King. Theodore could finally breathe. The two of them had bought the quiet, peaceful cottage that they had always talked about.
He'd always talked about it. He was happy. The cottage was perched in the middle of the woods, far enough away from civilization that she could pass days without seeing another person. Sometimes it felt like they must have lost, because the world that she knew wasn't there anymore.
They'd bought the quiet cottage they'd always talked about and filled it with things.
She shouldn't resent him his clutter. He deserved clutter. She knew he deserved clutter, his house full of little wooden figurines he carved, after everything.
They'd filled it with things because they were allowed to do more than simply need now.
She hated the clutter.
They were allowed to want and build a home because home no longer had to be wherever the resistance had camped up for the night. Honestly, Theo had thought he'd be dead before that ever happened. Being born the chosen one, nobody had ever expected him to survive fate long enough for the aftermath, least of all him.
It was a terrible thing to want happiness, but not know what to do with peace. She'd learned to love him fighting, but now he loved gently, sword forgotten, armour laid to rest, and that was not the version of him that she'd fallen in love with.
Didn't that mean he had earned the right to be happy now?
She missed the man she'd fallen for.
She sat opposite him at the kitchen table and took his hand and looked at him like the world still needed saving, like he hadn't done enough.
Theo,
She said.
This isn't working. I'm sorry.
It came out of nowhere.
She couldn't do this anymore.
I don't have nightmares, he said.
Because he was the only one who had truly suffered.
We won. I killed the Shadow King. If anyone should have nightmares... He forced his expression to ease. He shouldn't resent Adina her nightmares, if she had them. He knew the battlefield they had met upon. In a world of blood and conquest and power that made him feel like he was going to sizzle from the inside out, she had been a cooling balm. She had made him a man instead of something out of legend. I know you were there too, he continued, because she was acting like he'd somehow forgotten that. But it's over. Didn't she see that it was over? Whatever nightmares you have, we'll get through it together, yeah? They're only dreams.
Memories.
His jaw clenched. They can't hurt you unless you let them.
Was it so simple? Had she got it wrong? Was she merely not trying hard enough to move on? His expression told her that yes, she needed to try harder. They were supposed to be a team, but, to his mind, when it came down to it, he'd been the one alone against the Shadow King, hadn't he? So if he could heal, then why couldn't she? She hadn't been the one buckling under the weight of prophecy. She had no right.
Her mouth clicked shut and she swallowed hard. At some point during the argument, they'd both surged to their feet. Her arms were crossed against her chest, defensive, like either of them should have any need for defences anymore. They were safe with each other. She knew that. Before she started this conversation, they had been fine. Hadn't they been fine?
If there was a button that could make me feel differently,
she managed.
I would hit it in a heartbeat. God, I know this isn't your fault. I'm not saying that. I know you've gone it through enough. I know this isn't fair, but
You just need time.
That was the other thing everyone always said, along with happily ever after. Time healed all wounds. She just needed time. But how much time was that? Too much, it seemed. There had been a woman she met in the aftermath of the battle at Sunburst Fields. She had lost her lover. Adina couldn't remember the woman's name, only what she had confessed when no one else was there to hear her.
They had time now, didn't they? Walking through the woods filled him with a calm he'd never known before. The green trees, dappled by sunlight, made it impossible to dwell on the cold feeling of bloodied stone against broken bones. Everything was light and air and the freedom to run. There were no people to be responsible for, no important envoys to encroach upon the time they'd managed to snatch together, always wrenching them apart. It was him and her, and they didn't have to live in a stolen moment anymore. Wasn't that enough?
The woman said, I'm not allowed to mourn her. No one knew we were together, you see. She had a husband. But she loved me, and no one will ever know now, and I must mourn her like she wasn't mine to mourn, like I might mourn a stranger. The woman's voice dropped to barely audible. And I think it might just kill me. How do you heal a hurt when you have to pretend it's not there, like it's a paper cut instead of a bullet wound? How can you be so okay?
Adina's voice crumpled on the question, so small, and it felt like a knife between his ribs because it sounded like an honest question, too.
After everything.
Her eyes were big and desperate. He recoiled. He could finally breathe, and she would have him drown. After everything, he was allowed to be okay. Was he supposed to live forever feeling guilty for everything he could have done better? Was he supposed to have died too?
He fought to protect her, to protect all of them. In his story, she was the victory he came home to. She was his happy ending. She was not supposed to be broken.
Maybe, yes, in her story he should have. It was easier to love a legend than a man. It was easy to make promises to someone who wouldn't live to hold you to them. For a second, he hated her more than he'd ever hated the Shadow King. He didn't want to be a thing of hate anymore. He didn't want to fight anymore. Everything? He repeated, oh so softly. His fists curled, nails digging into his palms, hard enough to draw blood, and he didn't want to ever draw blood again either. He stopped. He relearned how to breathe. You do not get to hold everything against me, Adina. I did everything you asked of me. That all of you asked of me. For you. For this.
Theo.
We love each other. He turned away because he couldn't look at her. That's all that matters. We'll get through this. Happily ever after. Please. He closed his eyes. You want to talk about everything? After everything, let me have this. Give me this. It is the only thing I ever asked of you.
He had fallen in love with her when she was selfish. A good, selfless girl did not love in a stolen moment, after all. Stolen moments had to be taken from someone. But he didn't want selfish now. He didn't want someone who had done battle, who had hurt and been hurt. He didn't want a woman with a shadow in her heart.
She exhaled a shaky breath. The silence stretched. Then she kissed him sweetly, gently, like everything was okay. She whispered the words against his lips.
I'll try.
It was better again after that. Their fight became another battle of the past to be buried with their dead and forgotten. In the mornings, they would paint the sunrise that they had once spent hours trying to picture, when the endless night of the Shadow King's reign felt like it might never break. The first time Theo had seen that the sky could truly be pink, he thought maybe, just maybe, he hadn't made it through after all. But he had. In the afternoons, they would walk hand in hand through the woods, and he would tell her about all the new growth he was learning about. He liked the names, the colours, the hope. It wasn't perfect. Now that she'd pointed it out, he stirred sometimes in the night to find her awake still. When he caressed her face in the dark, his hand would come away wet with silent tears.
And so, he fell out of love with her in the way that a person forgets their wallet on the train, with that stabbing sense of panic, of leaving something vital behind, without yet being able to place what was gone.
On those nights, he would kiss her honeyed and slow, because he didn't have to kiss her like she was oxygen anymore, until she melted in his arms and smiled again.
Instead, he fumbled and groped for the debris, the receipts, the bits of change and dust at the bottom of the bag of them that had meant something important once. He began to look at her like a stranger when she reminded him that she was sharp, that he had loved something sharp once.
The weeks turned into months, which turned into years. She stopped crying with time. She healed.
He looked for clues for what was missing.
The shadows were gone. And so, they all lived happily ever after.
He would never find her.
Simone, what inspired you to write this story?
It was a mixture of three things. I started with the final paragraph, actually. The final paragraph in the footnotes. And because whenever I know I want to write a short story, I keep a notebook of things I've written in the past several years, which I think sound pretty, and I haven't done anything with them. It's just like a line or something that I really like. And in this case, it was the idea of falling out of love with someone that I really wanted to explore, find that kind of thing really interesting. The other thing was I was reading a Kirsty Logan novel for ideas, Things We Say in the Dark, and she did this thing where she had a story which had footnotes in that completely contradicted the story that she was telling. And I thought, oh my god, that's really interesting, I want to try that. And then I kind of thought, okay, What about the idea of a relationship instead of a plot that's in conflict with each other? So you've got these two characters telling completely different versions of the same story at once, and that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, I really liked that you said, okay, so traditional stories have all got this really strong hero figure. What about the other characters, though? We're all focused on what's happy and good for him. We have very protagonist-centered way of looking at stories, but we don't really think about, are the other characters around them okay with this?
And we should mention in audio we have two voices reading the story, but in written form it's footnotes. So the female voice is the footnotes, right? I feel like as an effect that means that that voice is more subdued.
I mean, I guess it depends on how you read it. I mean, to a certain extent, footnotes will always be something that's a lot easier to miss, which is one of the reasons I wanted the woman's voice to be in the footnotes, because I think in those kinds of stories where we often talk about war, the female voice is a footnote to the larger story. Like if you think about any stories about Trojan War, the women just didn't get a say, so I kind of wanted the footnotes to reflect that format.
Do people read footnotes? I'm like one of those terrible people that if I'm reading anything academic and I see there's a footnote, I'm like, yeah, okay. And then I sort of read the whole thing first, and then I go back and check the footnotes. So that's what I did with this. So I was quite surprised when I went back and read this completely different story that was happening between the lines. I think the best way to read it is I had it as a Word document, and if you hover over a footnote, the text of it comes up. That worked so well for me. I was just there like, oh, this is how you're meant to read it, and it makes it quite interactive and interesting.
Yeah, I wanted it to be kind of like a conversation between the two characters. I mean, not a conversation they were actually having, because the entire conversation they're having is not talking about what the actual problem is. I really like that idea, and the idea of the female voice kind of jutting in, which you get more if you do the hovering method that you mentioned, rather than reading it all at the end. I can't remember who wrote the book, but I remember when I was a teenager, I read a book which had footnotes in. It was a YA book, and in the footnotes it had all of the characters' friends commenting on the plot, and that always stayed with me because I remember finding it absolutely hilarious at the time, so it's something I've wanted to do for ages. But like you, I don't read the footnotes, so I haven't until now.
I mean, whether I read them or not depends very much on what it is. I find as a form it's quite interesting. It's a good way of interjecting things that don't really fit within the flow of the actual prose. But I did find it kind of confusing to read because you feel like you kind of have to go backwards and forwards. And then if you go and read the footnote and then you come back, you have to remember what the sentence was saying so you can read the rest of the sentence. And it did mess with my head a little bit.
Yeah, it can be a bit jarring. I don't think I'd do it on a longer piece of work, but I was curious to try it on a shorter one. That's something I've always wanted to try.
Do you feel like it worked in the final thing?
I feel like it worked in the final thing. Like, yes, it can be a bit jarring, but particularly I think because I've got the voices quite down in my head, I know how I would read it, and I get more of a sense of flow because I know what's coming and I'm familiar with what's coming, so I don't lose my place in the way that someone new to it would.
That makes sense. I was thinking about whether you could write it with brackets or in a different way, and then I was like, no, footnotes. Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't think of another way to do it.
It's probably the best way of doing it, yeah. Because, I mean, it's been used quite a lot, right? We've got John Green book used footnotes, Abundance of Catherine's. Terry Pratchett uses them all the time.
House of Leaves by Mark C. Danielewski has a very interesting version of that, in that depending on if you read the footnotes or not, you get a completely different novel. He used it for horror effect in that. I think I love the idea of something hidden in a novel through the footnotes, but at the same time, they're a pain to read. I appreciate that. Yeah, I guess it's the idea of someone being a footnote in history as well appealed to me for this specific story. So I think it changed how I told the story quite a lot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it wouldn't be the same story without it, right?
Well, I probably wouldn't have written that specific story if I didn't want to do the footnote thing. The structure almost came before the plot in this instance.
I like the simplicity of it, that it's just, I guess on the surface, a couple having an argument, but you only get the other side if you read the footnotes. And the bit where she talks about him falling out of love with her, oh my heart, I love the metaphor you use about losing your wallet and not realising what you've lost till it's too late. It's ouch.
Yeah, I remember when I came up with that line, it was a couple years back, and As you can guess, it's because I'd not forgotten my wallet, but I think I thought I'd forgotten my phone on the train back when I commuted, and it's just a moment of utter world-ending panic of, like, you're, like, digging through your bag, trying to figure out what it is, because like, there's something wrong, but you haven't quite figured out what's wrong yet. And I thought, yeah, I can see how that mood could translate to a relationship.
The conflict is really strong in this. Like, he just wants to have what he's dreamed of, and he hasn't allowed for the fact that maybe his partner's dreamed of something different. He doesn't even let her talk. He just says, no, you need to be happy for me. Like, it's quite harsh. He almost changes from a hero into a villain, because I was thinking about the beginning where in the footnotes it says that they're in the middle of a forest in the middle of nowhere. That almost brings back fairy tale images of princesses trapped in towers. Pretty creepy.
It is, and yet we also use that kind of thing for a very ideal retreat away from civilization and stresses. Like, whenever you think of, like, getting away to the country, it's always painted like paradise. So I find it interesting that you rooted so much more for the woman, because I was trying to make it that neither of them was exactly right. Like, I didn't want to demonize one and not the other. I don't know if I succeeded in that, but I wanted it to be fairly equal.
Yeah, I think it was.
I could understand both points of view, definitely.
I think it's interesting that the story is primarily about relationship mechanics. You've chosen this almost fantasy setting for it.
I find it difficult to engage with things that can be too realistic, not in the least because then I have to do a lot of research, and I hate doing research of historical periods. But also I think because when you write about the real world, you'll get bogged down with the real world conflict, and people will focus on that instead of the emotions and the relationship to a certain extent. So when you make something fantasy, you can kind of talk about the problem in a more pure way that I think people can almost empathize with more clearly because they don't have their own preconceptions that they're bringing to it.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're kind of using fantasy as a way to abstract away from the real world rather than specifically to put us in another world?
Yeah, because I think it's not a story about one specific conflict. Like, I can see it applied to, like, loads of events in our history. For example, men who went to war and then came back, and it's the idea that, well, they went to war and they went through horrific things, and of course they did, but it wasn't just them who was going through a war. And obviously they're very different types of trauma, but they are both types of trauma. And there's the idea that one gets prioritized more, so if the person who has worse trauma is doing okay, how dare you not be doing okay? And I think it's something that comes up a lot and can be quite, if not universal, it's not specific to one conflict. And fantasy allows it to be unspecified.
I think the fantasy element ups the drama of it. We had to fight the Shadow King, and she's obviously talking about this woman survivor that she's talked to. I imagine sort of some desolate battlefield somewhere, and the fact that she loves him when he fights, things like that. I think it amplifies the emotion almost to put it in that setting.
Yeah, it's the other idea, isn't it? You can fall in love with someone in specific circumstances, and then you get happily ever after, and the circumstances are inherently changed by the nature of you're suddenly at peace. Like, the entire dynamics of your relationship would change. Like, I remember in the Hunger Games, I remember reading the ending, spoiler alert to people who haven't read the Hunger Games, and suddenly Katniss and Peter are living quietly with their little kids somewhere, and the same with Harry Potter. You switch and jump forward 30 years and suddenly they've got a family and kids, and it's a disconnect that I've never wrapped my head around, and yet which no one seems to talk about. I don't know how you jump from something like that to suddenly living what is essentially middle-class suburbia.
I haven't really thought about it like that. I think the Katniss one bothered me more.
Well, you haven't read Harry Potter.
No.
Don't tell anyone. They'll riot.
But she just brings children into a world that she's not fond of it, is she?
And it's like the idea for it to be a happy ending, you need to be married, you need to have the kids, and I don't know, to me that's just not a happy ending. I mean, it can be if that's what you want, but if it's not, it's a trap.
I guess it's a very traditional idea of happy ending, like the fairy tale happily ever after. That's what it means to most people. I think it's probably the idea of happily ever after is different for different people, but we're always given the same one in stories, which is why it feels a bit off in things like Harry Potter.
The thing is, a lot of people reading Harry Potter are going to have those very normal lives. So it's almost like a metaphor for the book ending, right? You kind of return to normality.
And I can see that for older readers. I think when the time when I finished it, I was 18, and suddenly the people who had basically been around my age had jumped to a version of life that I didn't understand or know, and it felt jarring. I guess that's kind of something I wanted to explore in this piece as well, like point between, yay, we've beat the bad guy and happily ever after. Like, I feel like there's a period in between those things which have a lot of stories in that don't get told.
Yeah, like I was thinking about this in the context of not many stories start with established couples who stay together.
I'd like to see, I think, more novels with established couples who have to communicate through their problems, and it's not all just a will they, won't they. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the tension of a will they, won't they done well. And it always makes the starting the romance to be the point rather than the hard work of keeping it.
Yeah, the easy, fun path.
I guess people view that as kind of a story. If they're together at the start of the book and they're together at the end of the book, people might think, oh, well, nothing's changed. They might think there's no point to the story.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah, but that's a very limited view on character development, isn't it?
It is quite reductive, but I think that's the thing that you'd have to be careful of if you were to write that.
Yeah, you'd need some other plot going alongside it, I guess.
Well, you need to make sure that something does change through the course of the story. Even if they're still together, their relationship must be different at the end.
Yeah, would agree.
I thought I remembered something from The Writer's Tale by Russell T Davies. He's a writer who revived Doctor Who, and he said, if there is an ending where the Doctor wins and beats the monsters, there's always a price and a cost to it, and he uses that to kind of, I guess, balance his endings. If you win, there needs to be some kind of price to it, because just everything was fine. He didn't feel like that cut it in terms of story. Would you agree with him?
I would absolutely agree with that. Like, I think in real life, there's always a cost. So I think, like, a little or a big cost. But there is always a cost to making decisions, because if you go down one path, inherently the path not travelled is sacrifice, for example. And I think for the stakes of a story to feel genuine and authentic and feel like the victory meant something, you had to lose something. And it doesn't have to be like a traditional sacrifice, but something has to be lost.
I think in a lot of stories, if the cost is what happens during the story, right? It's having to go through whatever trials they're going through.
Yeah, loss of innocence and normality.
Perhaps that was particularly important in Doctor Who because you have a main character who is very old and it's hard to attribute that kind of human cost to him. So you need something else.
Also, I think the higher the stakes, the higher the cost has to be.
I just thought it was interesting because I never thought about that. Like, I love a happy ending. I'm a sucker for a happy ending because it's nice and it's neat and it never happens in real life. So why can't we have it in a story every once in a while?
I mean, happy endings do absolutely happen in real life, but I also agree, despite popular belief and my love of angst, I do tend to want a happy ending at the end, with occasional exceptions.
I just think there's something satisfying as a reader to get to the end and for everything to be okay.
I mean, it's the idea that you've invested so much in these characters and their relationships and their troubles that to get something bleak just feels like you've been cheated. Like, what was the point of that if I don't get something happy at the end of it? I'm aware, as I say this, that the ending to this story, despite the title, is not actually happy, so I'm being a massive hypocrite.
No, I was going to say that's exactly what your main character's saying in your story, that they've been through this horrible thing and now they just want their happy ending. I don't think an unhappy ending is a bad thing all the time. I just was kind of thinking about why they're popular and why people like them and why I like them as well.
I think also the longer the story is, the more weight your ending has. So in that sense, short stories, happy endings, not as important.
But if you got to the end of Harry Potter and it turned out that Voldemort won, how would you feel?
I mean, the fanfics go into that quite a lot, but in terms of the actual books, I'd be annoyed.
Personally, I'd be kind of pleased.
Really? Why?
I would be intrigued because it would be such a bad thing to do that I would love it.
I mean, you'd want another book, though, wouldn't you? To, like, resolve the conflict. I think that's human nature. We don't like to end on a tragedy. We don't like to lose.
I think in any traditional sense, that kind of ending to that long of a series would be really bad. But I think there is a world in which someone can pull it off, and I would really like to read that book.
I think it would be interesting, and I think you'd need to set it up that way throughout the books. Like, I don't think you could do it as a deus ex machina at the end. Like, exactly. You'd have to see the reasons that they're winning, and it'll be because of the hero's fatal flaw or something like that, which is how Macbeth works, for example. or any kind of Shakespearean tragedy where the tragic flaw causes a downfall, it won't be because the protagonist simply wasn't good enough. It would have to be more complicated, or them succumbing to their own dark side, or something like that.
Like a character who, I'm sure this has been done, but a character who starts off trying to do the right thing and then gradually becomes a villain, but is still the protagonist.
Quite a big horror trope, right?
The idea of what is right is so subjective, isn't it? Same as the idea of what's your happy ever after. Like, it's going to vary. Even if you don't agree, that doesn't necessarily mean that the other person's wrong.
I did have one question about this story, actually. So we kind of know what the hero wants, what Theo wants, but what does Adina want? Does she just want him to acknowledge what happened? Does she want a different life altogether? What does she want?
I think she wanted space to mourn what she'd lost. Like, obviously, war is a terrible thing. And I say this as someone who's never actually been in a war. Like, as an idea, I think you can go through so much with people that to a certain extent, I can imagine you would miss the intensity or miss the idea of being part of something. Like, you get all of those accounts, don't you? It was horrible, but we pulled through as a community. That I think you can miss something horrible and want space to grieve that. And when people don't give you the space to grieve something, it turns into a horror story. I think Kirsty Logan had a brilliant quote on it, which was one of the things that inspired the story. The second you can't mourn something you've lost, it turns into a horror story rather than a tragedy. It turns into something repressed, which is a very gothic trope. Basically will come back to haunt you and you can't get over it because you don't have any way of letting it out or letting it go. That you can't fix something until you acknowledge it happened and that it hurt and that it could have been important. And it's the idea that she wants to be the woman who was sharp and capable of doing terrible things, and for him to still love her despite that, not want the version where there are no shadows left because they've defeated the Shadow King, when realistically, like fantasy aside, a world without shadows just isn't possible. You need sorrow to be happy. Theodore is not acknowledging the shadow because he killed it.
Do you think that he can't see even the shadows in himself then? He's not very self-aware.
Oh, he's absolutely not self-aware.
Because at the end of the story, he still hasn't figured out that he's lost her.
He thinks everything's fine. She stopped crying, so clearly she's happy.
It's really sad because she's just sort of hanging in there.
Like, I don't know what you'd do in that situation because they're both right.
He would need to acknowledge that she's not okay and they would need to talk about it.
I like to believe in a happy ending after this novel. Several years down the line, they talk about it and their relationship changes and gets better. And, some actual healing happens, but sadly not in this one. It's the idea, isn't it? Once you hit happily ever after, everything has to be fine. Because you're happily ever after. It's not happily ever after for a couple months and then it all goes to hell.
Well, this comes from fairy tales. I think that was probably the first origin of the happily ever after ending.
I think it works to a certain extent for children, but I think in an adult life where we still carry over a lot of those tropes, they don't quite fit, and I think that causes a tension.
Like, we're happy to believe it as children.
I think we try to believe it as adults. It's the concept of a wedding, isn't it? Like, you don't think, oh God, we're going to divorce.
I guess it's a big thing in fiction that everybody dreams about their wedding day. I have a somewhat silly question now. Was this at all inspired by the song My Happy Ending by Avril Lavigne?
It was not, but now I really want to reread it while listening to that song. In some subconscious way, it's possible just because any ideas I have is brain mulch of things I've read recently and or listened to or drawn or just my general life experiences and thought.
No, I think you should come up with a 90s/early 2000s pop song for every story that we do.
That's just the era I vibe with.
It's your job now. You're the musical expert.
Yeah, we have to end with whatever pop song you chose.
Make a playlist for the podcast.
I often think about songs when I'm writing short stories, especially. I don't know why.
I guess it's shorthand for mood.
What would you guys change if you could change anything? I assume you don't think it's perfect in every way. Though I will be flattered if that is the case.
I think I'd give more of an idea of what Adina did. I mean, I know she was there, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I'd like to know what her role was. Was she just on the sidelines, or was she in the thick of it by his side and wasn't credited? even though he couldn't have saved the world on his own.
I thought of it, at least when I was writing, is on the thick of it by his side. Like, you get those teams and there's the chosen one, but everyone's like, it's the chosen one who saved the world. And everyone's just like, I mean, I was there too.
I know, if you were like, I want to meet the guys from Buffy, and Buffy wasn't there, it was just like Willow and Xander, you'd be like a bit disappointed.
Yeah, like, the people couldn't have done it without them, but somehow the fact that they couldn't have done it without them goes ignored almost. In the end, it always comes down to the protagonist, never mind that the protagonist wouldn't have got that far without their help.
Do you think maybe supporting characters aren't given enough credit in stories?
No, I don't think they are, and I know I'm guilty for this as well, because I love me a protagonist. And obviously, if your protagonist isn't doing the majority of the work, I think you're failing slightly.
Some of my favourite parts of stories are when a character who's been kind of a supporting member of the cast for most of the story suddenly steps up and just completely changes the plot. It's one of my favourite things.
It's great, isn't it? It's like misdirection. Like, they were there all along, so it's not like Deus Ex Machina where they've come out of nowhere. And then they do something and you're like, I'm so sorry, I underestimated you.
Anyway, what I would change, on reflection, I can't get over the form. I don't like footnotes, I'm sorry. I respect you for doing it.
I don't think I'd do it again, but I would do it again for this story.
I think if I were to do it, I would have it as two separate scenes with very similar structure so that they contrast off each other. So they'd be talking about the same kinds of things at each part of the scene. It's almost like it's the same scene, I suppose, but you'd have the different perspectives.
Interesting.
So would you write the exact same scene twice, or would you use a different scene?
It would be a very similar scene, but it'd be like, the first paragraph they talk about this aspect of their relationship. So you can kind of see that the structure is the same, but you have the different perspectives.
You'd have to have them mirroring each other, I think, so they're not exactly the same, but They kind of reflect off each other. I can see that working. It would be a different story, but I can see it working.
Oh yeah, I agree. It would be different, but I'm a bit of a purist when it comes to form.
What's your go-to for form then? Like, what's pure?
Everything should just be prose. Like, don't mess around with it. I've run into some stories that don't even use, like, direct dialogue. I kind of like it sometimes. It depends on the story. It's just prose.
It drives me crazy when they don't use dialogue. I hate it. I could not survive without dialogue. It's my one crutch in writing.
My writing's very dialogue heavy.
It depends very much on the story. But sometimes you're better off without it, I think.
I think I got told I was terrible at writing dialogue when I was 13, so I really worked at it, and now it's the only thing I know how to do.
What do you think is your top tip for writing dialogue? Because you do it so well, and I'm curious.
Thank you. I would probably have a few. One, be careful on your adverbs in terms of technical writing style. So, for example, do not go...
Whispered quietly?
Well, yes, whispered quietly is an example. So, in that sense, it would be because the whispered already suggests the quiet, so you don't need whispered quietly. I don't go as far as Stephen King to say that the road to hell is paved with adverbs. I think they have their place. But just use said, basically, because readers skip over said, so it goes unmarked, and you can just use it as a tag for who is speaking. And you should probably only use adverbs, at least is my gut go-to, if it's against the grain of whatever they're saying. So, for example, if someone is saying something really threatening, but in a very gentle tone, I think it's worth using an adverb there to mark, because there's a conflict there, and it's unusual. So that kind of thing. And the other piece of advice would be that characters rarely say what they actually mean. Like, you can have moments of honesty, of course, but people in general don't say what they mean a lot of the time. And certainly they don't always in novels come out with saying why they are immediately saying that. There'll be undercurrents to what's happening and things that they believe and want that they're not just going to come out and say. It's like whenever you've got two characters who love each other. Yes, it's great when you get to the I love you, but before that there's a hell of a lot of bits where they avoid saying I love you for any number of reasons. And I'm not saying make up excuses, I'm saying talking about your feelings is hard.
You can write two characters saying I love you without using the words I love you.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent, I love you has its place, but we've overused it so much that I think other things, like for example actions that show how much you care about someone, can have more impact in a novel. Like, I love you is almost telling rather than showing. It's not going to mean anything to me unless you've proved it first.
Definitely, good tips.
What would your guys' dialogue tips be?
I would agree. I might even go further and to say that the way in which they said it should be evident from what it is that they're saying. And you don't even need said a lot of the time. Put something else there. It should be clear who's talking. If it were all possible, just have no dialogue tag.
I mean, yes, you can use an easy beat, which for anyone listening is when you have the character do something instead. So, for example, it can be shrugging or moving across the room, anything action related they're doing, or a thought, which makes it clear who's talking without actually using a dialogue tag.
Or just make it clear from context or their voice.
One of my early writing sins was that I used a tag every time there was a line of dialogue. And I didn't realise I was doing it. I only realised when I had someone else look at it and they just put lines for every time I wrote said, and I was like, yeah, she's right. I don't need this because it's obvious he's talking. I was just so used to doing it that I just did it without thinking about it.
My dialogue sin used to be that I didn't paragraph, so you didn't get any line when a new person spoke.
Oh no.
I know. It was awful.
It'd be a bit confusing.
It was so confusing, but I wasn't ever formally taught creative writing at that point, so I had no idea that was what I was supposed to be doing.
It's funny how these little things actually end up making quite a big difference sometimes.
Yeah, like you can do so much emphasis with, for example, putting something down on a separate line, but it's not traditionally done in novels, so it didn't occur to me up until I started doing a lot of writing online that the way I structure writing can do a lot to emphasize or minimize from things that I say. Because in novels, a lot of the time it feels like a massive block. Like, it doesn't bother you in a novel in the same way it might if you were looking at it online. You rarely see novels with, for example, if you're listening, you can look up the version of the story on our website, and you'll see how I structured it, and it's not the same as how you would structure a novel because there's so many more line breaks.
I think that works well for short form writing.
I mean, it's the same though in a novel though. On my manuscripts, I do the exact same thing. I don't write it in a traditional, how it would look in a book style. I've got too used to writing online and reading writing online that I now automatically write in the format I would do for if I was publishing something online.
I guess it's just kind of a new way of looking at the form.
I also think it makes it easier for anyone who's reading it online. Hopefully some poor agent one day. I mean, they're two different formats and I think you can play with them a lot. And I think you can play with structure a lot depending on what kind of story you're writing. I know you're a purist, but I also disagree. And I say this as someone who hates modernism with a passion.
Okay. No, it's fair. It's good we have differing opinions. Right, I had one more thing I wanted to ask, which was, did you notice that, because you started writing this, you said one of the first things that inspired the story was that you wanted to write with footnotes. Have you noticed that in things you write, there's often common themes? There's always the same ideas you kind of come back to?
Yes, I would say I very much have a type in what I like to write. Mine would probably be, it comes down, I think, a lot to antagonists and protagonists, in that I like playing with characters' dark sides and how they're foils to each other. Same with anything that's slightly fairy tale themed, like, for example, deconstructing happily ever after is pretty classic Simone. And obviously it's pretty much always comes down to relationships. I'll have a fantasy world, I'll have a plot. But I'm basically building that so I can talk about whatever my main relationship is.
How much of that do you think is conscious and how much you just kind of do without thinking?
Oh, it's very conscious. I have a dynamic I want to write about, and then I'm like, oh god, I need a plot. What am I doing? Okay, scramble. Unless there's a specific plot point I want to deconstruct, in which case I start with the plot and then build characters around that.
Yeah.
Do you think it was something you became aware of over time, or did you always know from when you started writing that was the kind of thing you wanted to write about?
I think I've grown into it more. I think there were always similarities in the kind of things I was interested in. But I think I've refined it. Like, I took the thing I loved and I ran with it, basically. Because I couldn't find content for it, so now I've made it my thing. When other people do it, maybe I'll consider writing something else.
I mean, I say this because I make a great effort to write lots of very different kinds of stories and in different genres. But I've noticed that without even really thinking, there's so many common threads between my stories that you can piece together, even though I'm trying to write something very different.
I think we, as humans, have things that we return to because it's what interests us. And I think we all have a key question that we want answered. And I think a lot of our things circle around that question. And we don't necessarily know what the question is, and it can be very broad, but I think there's something that we always return to as individuals.
That's an interesting take. Perhaps a good thing for character building as well. Find that question.
Yeah, I've got no idea what the question is, but I can feel that all my writing is circling something. I just don't know what it is.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. As always, you can find our stories and our previous episodes on our website at theshortstoryworkshop.com. If you'd like to contact us, you can do so via Twitter. I am at MattBWriter. Mel.
I'm at Ficaholic.
And Simone.
T_M_typewriter, also known as the modern typewriter.
Simone, is there anywhere we should direct people who want to read more of your work?
Yeah, I have a Tumblr account, themoderntypewriter.tumblr.com.
Okay, cool. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.